3 years without ever touching her, but when the prince finally decides to claim his wife, the palace opened like a theatre, all gilding and glass and the hush of velvet shoes on parquet. Elodie felt the air change as soon as she stepped from the corridor into the state salon. It always changed here, warmer, brighter, and colder in ways that had nothing to do with coal or candle. Her ladies melted to shadow behind her, as they had been taught. A seam of courtiers parted, as if her presence were a draught that might extinguish a flame. She did not flinch. Her composure had been practiced like scales at a piano: breath, chin, step, turn. She entered as protocol demanded, eyes lowered, head inclined, hands quiet and folded. Her gloves were plain white linen, embroidered by a patient hand. Not Parisian lace. Her own thread, her own hours. The stitches crossed and looped in a pattern that meant nothing to anyone but her. They had been mocked once, gently, then not so gently. Tonight, they were just gloves. The chandeliers burned with 1,000 small suns. Wax scented the air, sweet and heavy over the sharper polish of oak. Musicians in the gallery tuned with soft obstinacy, one string insisting on a better note. Somewhere behind her, a woman laughed too loud and then coughed to cover it. "Those," someone murmured, not bothering to whisper. "She persists with them." "Perhaps she believes the court will change for her," another replied. "She believes nothing," a third said, soft as a pin sliding into silk. "She hopes. See how she stands." Elodie held her place at the edge of the dais, one step below where the royal family would receive presentations. That single step mattered. It announced that she belonged, and also that she did not, depending on the angle of the eye. She had learned to borrow power from small details. The settle of a hem, the measured turn of a shoulder, the refusal to blink when a glance expected it. She kept the unseen rhythm, hands together, fingers hidden by linen, the gloves warmed in the heat of so many bodies. She let her gaze lift just enough to catch the room as a painter would. Surface and line, light and shadow, without names. The master of ceremonies moved through the crowd like a ship through reeds. He traced the path from door to dais, lips moving around order of precedence, a staff balanced in his hand like a metronome for the entire night. He did not look at her. That was part of his courtesy. To see too much of her would be to admit that others had seen too little. A footman brushed past with a tray of cordial that went untouched. An envoy's wife adjusted a necklace as if the pearls might anchor her against an unpredictable current. Everywhere, small acts of steadiness. Elodie did not think of the hallway she had walked to reach this room, lined with portraits that watched without blinking. She did not think of the hushed words that followed her through corridors. Not now. The room itself required attention. The ceilings arched to a painted sky. The mirrors doubled and tripled the candles until faces glowed like saints and devils. A commotion at the far door rippled toward her like wind in wheat. She knew the cause before the door opened. Presence has a sound. It rides ahead of the person, a change in pitch, a shift in how people hold their chests, a pressure at the ears. She kept her eyes level and prepared to see him. He entered in uniform, dark cloth cut to a line that carried its own authority. Officers fanned behind him, a small wake of feathers and braids and bright metal. Advisors marked his pace like stones in a path, never quite in his way, always close enough to be useful. He did not look toward her. Adrian walked as he had been taught to walk, in a straight thought that took his body with it. He took in the room without appearing to. Faces, ranks, allegiances, the placement of chairs, the pattern of cards, the angle of the musicians' bows. He accepted bows and curtsies with a slight incline of the head that could be read as kindness or indifference depending on what one wished to see. An advisor gave him 3 names in a low voice, and the reason each name mattered. The master of ceremonies materialized at his elbow and murmured the evening's plot. Adrian's mouth barely moved in reply. He was a man inside a frame. He had learned to fill it without spilling. He did not look toward her. He knew she was there. The knowledge was a sensation more than a fact, the way one knows where a window is in a dark room. A coolness at a particular angle, a current. He allowed the awareness like one allows the temperature of the air, felt and ignored until it cannot be. The dais had been set. The chairs held the weight of history, without groaning. Adrian took his place near the throne, not on it. His father's seat remained empty tonight, by design. This was a reception for foreign dignitaries and domestic faction leaders, a dance and a negotiation disguised as one. He was the instrument. The tune would be played around him. He had been born to strain at that. A courtier near the front laughed too readily at something said too softly. A hand trembled on a fan and stopped itself. Adrian let his gaze pass over each small disorder as if it were a knot in polished wood. It made the surface interesting. It did not change the table. He permitted himself one glance toward the lower step to check a detail of protocol. She was as she always was, composed, slight, contained. The gloves he had once noticed without noticing flashed white against the darker field of the room. The stitches caught light and returned it in quiet. He took in that detail and put it away as he might put away a knife, sharp, useful at times, not for display. The musicians raised their bows together. The first chord snapped the air into shape. Conversation gathered itself, and then thinned as movement replaced it. The overture began, stately and careful, a definition of grace that had nothing to do with joy. It was music for keeping pace with one's own heart, without giving it away. Elodie looked up when the sound struck the ceiling and fell through the crystal like rain. She allowed the first notes to wash over her skin, a habit she had kept from a life with fewer mirrors. Music was a way of standing still when standing still hurt. She could not control a room. She could let a chord pass through her ribs and leave some part of her in time. People arranged themselves the way they always did at the start of a set. The most important near the dais, the less important making their importance obvious by pretending to be unconcerned with placement. A pair of younger gentlemen, bored into witlessness, started a private contest of bows to see who could seem most bored. Their boredom was a performance more exhausting than service. The master of ceremonies stood in the clear space before the dais. He lifted his staff. The head of it tapped once against the floor. The sound carried. "In honor of our guests," he called, voice trained to reach the far edges of a room without shouting, "and by the gracious will of the royal household, the opening quadrille shall be led by His Royal Highness and Her Royal Highness." The words landed like a stone on water. Circles formed. Ripples met and crossed. Elodie's spine did not alter, but the pulse in her throat ticked faster. The room shifted to accommodate the new fact. It had been years since she had stood with him in the place etiquette reserved. It had not been forbidden by law. It had been avoided by habit. A woman 2 steps away drew in breath like a thread pulled through fabric. "Well," she said to no one. "At last." "Protocol," a man replied, everything and nothing in one word. Another voice, sly with relief disguised as rank, echoed, "The court must be seen to move as one." Elodie lowered her gaze, and then lifted it the exact amount that allowed refusal to die unseen. The staff had sounded. The names had been given. There was no argument to be made in whispers now. She stepped forward. The distance between her and the center of the floor was not long. It contained 100 evenings of absence. She crossed it as she crossed every distance she had crossed since entering this house. One measured breath at a time. The music waited during her short walk, flourishing but patient, like an apology she would never be offered. She became aware of the way her dress moved against her legs, the way linen warmed on skin, the weight of the pins in her hair, the small catch of a thread at her wrist. She did not touch it. She did not adjust. She did not deliver to anyone the sight of her uncertainty. The herald called names in the old order, voice rising and falling like a priest's. He announced foreign titles that tasted of distant rivers and other winds. He announced her name as if he were clearing dust from a shelf. It was the same syllables she had always had, arranged around a rank she had not chosen. They sounded different, only because the room had decided to hear them differently tonight. He announced Adrian's name with care that suggested it could be broken by mishandling. Elodie did not look up to find him. She felt the shift in the floorboards when he moved. She heard the tiniest change in the musician's tempo, the way players respond to the presence of a person who has never touched an instrument, but has been an instrument all his life. She reached the edge of the set and waited a fraction early, formal, utterly composed. The empty space before her, a square of air, was suddenly a border that would or would not be crossed. Adrian had felt the impact of the Master of Ceremonies' announcement, like a small blow he had anticipated without preparing for. Protocol cut both ways. It guarded, it demanded. He took a breath through his nose that did not alter the line of his mouth. An advisor leaned near enough to be ignored later if necessary. "Your Highness," he said. "We must be seen." Adrian did not look at him. "Is that in question?" "Never," the advisor answered, too quickly. "But the figure is always the same," Adrian said. The advisor nodded because there was nothing else to do with the sentence. Adrian left the dais. The movement was simple. It seemed to take an hour. The court opened a path and then leaned in toward it without taking a step. He felt the weight of eyes not as a burden but as a measure. He had lifted heavier. He did not rush. Rushing is how one admits to fear. He walked the braid of carpet laid between dais and floor, past a pair of generals who pretended to talk about campaigns, past a cluster of women comparing the sparkle of identical jewels in different lights, past a young man trying so hard to disappear he had become the only visible thing in his corner. The music's first figure unfurled like a ribbon before him. He stopped at the place the Master of Ceremonies had indicated with a slant of his staff. The official nodded, satisfied by the geometry of it all. Adrian let the corner of his mouth move enough to acknowledge the nod. He looked at Elodie. She was framed by a spill of candlelight. The small stitches on her gloves marked a field of white with a map that no one else could read. Her hair was arranged to look like an accident of order. The line of her neck moved once, quietly, as she breathed. She had always stood well. He had noticed it as one notices balance in a blade, functional and dangerous if mishandled. He was aware of his own hands. They had served many purposes never visible to the people who believed they knew him. They knew reins and weapons and seals, and the weight of a pen when a sentence could send a man to a post or a pasture. They did not know the weight of hers. He presented his arm the way the manual of court demanded. Elbow bent, angle exact. The gesture was designed to carry meaning in an age that officially refused to rely on speech. It said, "We move as one tonight." It said, "Watch us and be reassured." It said nothing about love. It never had. He did not permit his eyes to drop to the gloves, but he permitted himself to register that they were there. Not the lace of a house that had forgotten winter. Not the silk of a family whose fortune had always held. Linen, fine and stubborn. He had said something about them once. He could not take back saying it. He could only govern whatever he did next. He inclined his head, exactly the degree between command and request, a place few men learn to stand without falling into one or the other. The Master of Ceremonies lifted his staff for the second time. The head tapped the floor again, and the sound leapt up into the chandeliers and came back down like a flock of birds turned all at once. "Mesdames et messieurs," he intoned, and his words were ceremony itself. The first figure. The orchestra swelled. The room leaned forward like a body poised to rise. To be seen leading was to be seen governing. To be seen governing was to be measured in every heartbeat and every misstep. Adrian knew it. Elodie knew it too. She stepped the smallest measure toward him. He matched it. A pair of courtiers at the edge of sight registered the movement the way deer register the pull of tide. A murmured wager died unspoken. Somewhere a fan closed without a snap. Adrian felt the exact distance remaining between his hand and her hand, inch, half inch, air warm with lights and bodies, the current that runs between two things when everything else has been cleared away. The master of ceremonies lifted his chin, and the herald took his cue, voice ringing with the clean brightness of brass. "Their Royal Highnesses," he called, and the names followed in the right order, each syllable hitting the air with the weight of a hammer on gold. Every face turned. Every sound thinned. The music held itself still, as if the bow were waiting for skin. Adrian moved his hand toward hers. The court stopped breathing. Her glove moved in the light. With all of France watching, his hand hung a breath from her glove and did not yet touch. His hand did not tremble. He let that be his single victory. Leather met linen with the tiny friction of fabric against skin, the sound swallowed by music and breath. The court exhaled in one hush that pretended to be nothing at all. Adrian bowed the exact measure required. He felt the give of her fingers through the glove, light and steady, not clinging, not cold. The first figure of the quadrille opened like a diagram. Advance, retreat, balance to the right. His body took the orders he had drilled into it since boyhood. His thoughts did not ask permission. "Your Highness," the master of ceremonies murmured from somewhere he could not see, voice a thread that stitched the room together. "At your pleasure." "Always," Adrian said, and the words sounded like a line from a book he had never finished. Elodie stepped into the pattern as if she lived inside it. The small tilt of her chin, the precise pivot of her shoes, the way her skirt lifted the least amount to allow motion and no more. She did not look at him. She looked at the floor between them as if the floor might misbehave. The chain began. Hands to hands, each touch a breath measured out for strangers, never a surrender. He offered his palm when the figure demanded it. The glove slipped across his skin, the seam of it like a raised vein. He had never catalogued a glove before. Now every stitch wanted telling. "Thank you," she said, so low the word could have been a ghost of a word. "For?" He kept his voice even, almost indifferent, the tone he reserved for the polite cruelty of civility. "Not letting me stumble," she answered. A beat followed. It would have been an inconvenience to protocol. He allowed the slightest correction to his grip to make it impossible for her to catch a hem on his boot. No one would credit him for it. That was better. Credit was a way of keeping the wrong score. The chain turned them away from each other. He watched her move into the line of other ladies, each station a rank written in silk. She made no effort to outshine or disappear. She made herself precise, which reads as serenity in a room hungry for error. He hated and admired the skill of it. He had required it of her without asking. He had despised her for providing it. They crossed again. A gentleman down the set coughed the way some men cough when they would rather laugh. Another man's eyes slid to a woman with diamonds too heavy for her throat. Adrian heard all of it, and heard none of it. He heard the musician in the gallery who habitually dragged the bow on the fourth beat. He heard the scrape of his own heel on polished wood, and logged the pressure of it the way soldiers log ground. "Is this tolerable?" he asked as they circled. "What should be tolerable is what is," she said. "Tolerance is a choice I was never asked to make." He felt the words like the quick edge of a blade turned flat and slid between ribs to avoid killing. It still surprised. "Then I will ask," he said. "You just did," she answered, and the smallest corner of her mouth dared to move. The set demanded separation. He lost her for 6 steps to polite men and smiling women, then took her again in the formal clasp. Somewhere to his left, an advisor's voice slipped through the music like smoke. "This is wise." Somewhere to his right, a woman who had once imagined herself in Elodie's place inhaled a jealousy so old it had gone stale. He kept his gaze on Elodie's shoulder as the figure turned. A single thread of her glove had loosened, a curl of white against white. He knew better than to touch it. "Do you despise this?" he said. He did not recognize himself until after it was spoken. He did not retract it. "I despise humiliation," she said. "The rest is air." "And me?" He could not tell if he had asked to punish himself or to test his cruelty. Her eyes lifted for the first time, not to his face but to the point just below his throat where a medal lay. The medal meant something to other men. It meant almost nothing to him. "I do not know you," she said. The orchestra swelled into the last figures. The master of ceremonies' staff struck the floor. Courtiers moved as if released from a spell that had required stillness. Applause fluttered and died before it became real. Adrian made sure to guide Elodie into the final bow, with a care that would yield no tittering for the next day's breakfast tables. As the music faded, the Grand Chamberlain's hand lifted to direct the promenade. Servants opened the doors to the gallery that led to the orangery. Spring had been late that year. The air that slid in carried the damp of stone and the green bite of leaves. People began to pour toward the promise of breath, unperfumed by wax. Adrian extended his arm again. Elodie accepted. He did not look to see who noted it. Everyone noted it. They moved along the gallery at the pace the Chamberlain prefers, a speed that allows observation to masquerade as leisure. The orangery's heat met the evening's cool and made fog on the glass panes. Citrus trees in their tubs gave off the clean bitterness of rind, a scent that cut the sweetness of the salon like truth in a room used to sugar. "Your Highness," a footman said, appearing with the question that footmen know how to ask without words. "Cloaks? Rain?" The suggestion hung between duty and presumption. Adrian nodded once, not to the footman, but to the idea. The man glanced at Elodie as if asking permission from a person who had not been permitted anything for 3 years. She spared him the uncertainty. "Yes," she said. "We thank you." The footman offered a cloak. For an instant the gesture paused, a hitch in the machinery of service. Who should place it? Who should accept? The pause was almost invisible, almost could be fatal. Adrian resolved it before it became embarrassment. He reached, took the cloak from the footman, and held it so that Elodie could lift her arms without exposing anything a court would pretend not to see while counting every inch. He set the wool over her shoulders with the same steadiness he had used earlier, a steadiness that refused to be tenderness or domination. It was action without question. "Protocol approves," she said softly. "Protocol is a jealous god," he replied. A droplet from the roof struck the edge of her glove and slid across the embroidered pattern like a traveler reading a map. The scent of orange leaf rose with the damp. Somewhere, a woman began to speak too brightly about last season's theater to distract from the fact that the prince had just done with his hands what he had avoided with his heart. They walked the length of the orangery and back. Every step a text annotated by the eyes of others. The orchestra in the salon shifted their score, murmured among themselves, then struck a chord to call people in again. The hour wore toward the next set. Conversation swelled, pushed by the same hands that always push a night along. From the far end of the gallery, the measured haste of boots approached. An usher, grey with the peculiar authority that comes from never raising one's voice, came straight to the nearest senior functionary. The words were intended for a small circle. Sound carries where meaning matters. "A sealed packet," the usher said, missing from the steward's desk, a dispatch destined for the Privy Council. Silence in a palace never falls entirely. It thins, like fabric held up to light. People do not stop moving. They move in different ways. The Grand Chamberlain did not allow alarm to become theatre. He turned and made a series of small gestures. Doors that should be open in hospitality were closed in prudence. Lesser entrances were secured, not slammed. Servants shifted from visible to invisible in the pattern of a household raised for centuries on the discipline of avoiding disgrace. "Ladies and gentlemen," a brief pause, the Chamberlain announced, pleasant as a man inviting friends to linger over coffee. "The second set will begin shortly. Pray avail yourselves of the galleries." Adrian felt the current change. He did not feel fear. Fear was for circumstances that admit to surprise. This was something else. He glanced at Elodie. Her posture did not betray herself or him. She stood as she always stood, straight as a vow. An official in livery approached, his bow respectful without being abject. "Your Highnesses," he said, "might I beg a moment of patience in the antechamber, only while the attendants search? By your leave." "Of course," Adrian said. Elodie inclined her head with the kind of assent that makes it unnecessary for anyone else to apologize. They let themselves be guided by the small pressure of choreography that turns events into inevitabilities. The corridor to the antechamber was narrow compared with the rooms they had just left. The sconces there burned low to preserve tallow. The stone held the day's chill the way stone holds its own counsel. A page opened the door, and they entered a room designed to be unimportant: 4 chairs, a small hearth, a window clouded by breath and weather. "We will return for you in a moment," the official said, already half-turned to carry out the order he had been given by someone who would never appear in the story. The door closed behind him. The sound of the latch falling should have been ordinary. Tonight, it was absolute. Elodie stood beside the window, hands inside her cloak, fingers still gloved. She did not take off the cloak. To remove it would have been to undress, even if only by a measure of wool. She watched the rain gather in long streaks that blurred the lamps in the courtyard into soft moons. She counted 3 breaths and let them go. She was not alone. That was the first fact. The second fact was that she had not been alone with him in a room that lacked a witness since the day someone had said they were married. She listened for footsteps outside the door. Footsteps came and went along the corridor. None stopped. None came in. "Should we call?" she said, not a question and not a suggestion, "to avoid misunderstandings?" "We could," Adrian said. He stood near the hearth and looked at the coals banked to red. "Or we could not. Silence is also a kind of statement," she said. "So is noise." She moved 1 step toward the warmth and stopped herself with a tiny contraction he saw in the line of her shoulder. She would not step toward him. Not for heat. Not for anything that could be read as a request. Her restraint had become a shield polished to a gloss. The mantel clock ticked not softly enough to be forgotten. The room smelled of damp wool and ash and the medicinal sweetness of orange from the corridor. Time was doing what time does, continuing because it refuses to do anything else. He did not know where to put his hands. At his sides, behind his back, on the chair. On the cloak, he had not realized he still held in one fist a fold of dark wool he must have gathered and brought without attending to it. He put it on the chair and let his fingers release the cloth. "Do you think?" he said, and stopped. He had begun a sentence he had not defined. "I think in different directions," she replied. "And then I stop thinking so I can breathe." "Practical," he said. "Necessary." And they were 2 pieces placed on a board without their consent, required to follow moves someone else had written. That had always been true. It felt less abstract here. He looked at her profile and saw nothing he could use to wound her that he had not already used. "You dance well," he said, because the worst kinds of truth hide in the smallest courtesies. "I learned," she said. "From whom?" "From the room," she said, and the next breath carried a shard of humor. "And from watchfulness. It teaches something like grace." Rain knocked at the window with a finger of wind. The sound made the space feel even smaller. He crossed 2 steps toward the fire and took the poker, lifting a coal so that flame licked up like a secret breaking into speech. Heat moved into the air, slow at first and then noticeable. Elodie's eyes followed the flame. "They bolted it," she said, a fact noted about a door and a decision. He listened. The bolt had a particular scrape when engaged. He had heard it 100 times from the wrong side. "They will unbolt it," he said. "When they have found what is missing," she replied. "What is missing," he said almost to himself, and smiled without joy. He set the poker down with a care that contradicted the force he wanted to spend. Then he turned. He had brought himself to this room. That was true enough. He had also been brought. He could not decide which made him less free. "Say what you came to say," she said, eyes on the fire. "Or do not say it. But do not use the air between us to rehearse it." He did not answer for a beat. The clock took 2 ticks and announced the 3rd. He let the sound go into his body and out again. "I came for nothing," he said, knowing how it would sound. "You never come for nothing," she said. "You come for not being seen, not coming." He let the sentence stand until its structure showed itself in the light. He had no defense worth speaking aloud. "Then I am here," he said. "And I have been." 3 years, she said. Not accusation, not mercy. Simple accounting. He looked at the glove on her right hand, the small loop of loosened thread like a question. He had mocked it once. He could not unsay a thing. He could only stand differently until a different thing became visible. "Those," he said, tipping his head toward her hands. "You still wear them." "They keep my hands from being naked," she answered. "It is a kindness I can give to myself when other kindnesses are not available." He absorbed that. He had thought many things about those gloves. He had not thought of them as mercy. He took another step toward the fire because someone had to do something, and this did not require agreement. "You could remove them here," he said, surprising himself with the offer. "No eyes." "And pretend the room has no walls?" she replied. "The walls have learned to write." Outside, a servant passed with a scuff and a cough that sounded like an excuse. Voices moved, muted, doors opening and closing with the same rhythm as the music they had left. A pair of steps paused. The bolt scraped and lifted. The handle turned. The door swung in a fraction, and then stopped as a head appeared, cap damp with rain. "Your Highnesses," the voice said, respectful, cautious. "A moment more, if you please. We are securing side passages, for your comfort." Adrian nodded, and the head withdrew. The bolt slid home again, an iron syllable concluding a sentence. He could taste the metal of decision. He did not want an audience when he chose. He had never not had one. That was the ridiculousness of a life like his. He had trained his body to move under weight. He had never trained it to move under want. "Do you wish to return to the room?" he asked. "When they come back for us?" "Do you wish to be seen returning with me?" she countered. "Or without?" He studied the question without flinching. "With," he said, "if the question is asked as you ask it. With." She let the word hang between them so it could collect its meaning. Then she nodded once, slow, as if she were agreeing to a treaty with a foreign power she could not afford to provoke. "Then we will return together," she said, "unless you choose otherwise before the bolt lifts again." "Do you expect me to?" he asked. "I expect you to do what keeps the room quiet," she said. "It is a habit. Habits are not destiny." The heat from the newly woken fire reached her at last and softened the line of her shoulders. The cloak held the warmth against her. A drop of rain found its way through a tiny crack in the window frame and fell on the sill with a sound too small for the room and exactly the right size for the heart. He watched the water bead, hesitate, and slide toward the edge. He wanted to lift his hand and catch it before it fell. He wanted to do something as useless and as kind as that. "Elodie," he said, and the use of her name felt like a trespass he could not punish himself for. She turned her head at last to look at him fully. Her eyes were not pleading and not hard. They were the eyes of a person who has stood a long time and is careful not to sit while others watch. "Yes," she said. He swallowed the speech he had prepared across 100 sleepless nights. It was a poor speech, made of policy, and phrases borrowed from men who cared about policy more than they cared about sleep. He hated it suddenly, with a boy's intolerance for a lesson that never ends. He could not speak it here. He would not. The clock ticked again. The fire shifted. Outside, rain changed its mind and softened. At the far end of the corridor, someone laughed, too steady to be accident. The laugh faded. Adrian looked at the space between them, then at her hands, then up to her face again. He did not know where to put his eyes that would not betray him. He settled them on the line of her jaw. It steadied him to see something raw made into grace. He moved. He did not plan the step. He took it. He crossed the carpet toward her. She did not retreat. He came toward her the way a decision crosses a threshold when argument is exhausted. The fire's new flame gilded his collar and made a narrow brightness on the line of his cheek. She felt the pull of heat and refused it. She had learned to refuse warmth when warmth cost too much. The clock marked the inch and the second. A drop of rain traced the window pane and hesitated, as if awaiting permission. He stopped an arm's length from her. Not far, not close. It was the kind of distance a court taught people to live at, where everything might happen and nothing did. "Do you think I am a coward?" he asked, voice even, eyes on the ash that lifted from the coal, as if he were measuring the weight of his own question. "I think you are practiced," she said, "in choosing what the room can accept." "What can you accept?" She could have laughed. She did not. "Dignity," she answered, "if it is not too dear." The answer held and then settled like the cloak on her shoulders. He watched her. She watched him watching, and the knowledge that he was capable of watching without judgment surprised her and made her want to deliver none. He took one breath that he did not disguise as any other action. "I have failed you," he said. "And myself." The words moved through her without lodging. A confession offered in a bolted antechamber was a kind of luxury. She did not trust it yet. Still, the simplest words have power because they fit everywhere. "Yes," she said. His mouth tightened, not in anger, in recognition. "At first, because I was angry. Then because anger is easy to keep and hard to put away. Then because men I have always obeyed found uses for my pride. And now," she said. She did not move her hands. The gloves were a stillness she could hold. "Now I do not know how to carry shame without making it your work." The honesty was small and exact. It made a clean cut. "Do not place it anywhere," she said. "Let it stand." "You would have me stand with it." "I would have you stand," she said, "with anything, or nothing. But stand." Silence opened, and did not become a wound. He took one slow step nearer. Heat reached the front of her dress through the cloak, and the smell of wool and ash rose and folded around them. His hands remained at his sides like two statements he had not chosen to make. Her hands remained within linen, fingers pressed together, palms damp and still. "I said once," he began, and the words faltered, then found their own light, "that your gloves were poorly chosen." "I remember," she said, and felt with wry detachment the small dignity of not rescuing him. "I was wrong," he said. The admission did not repair the insult. It did something quieter. It ordered the room correctly for one heartbeat. She breathed that heartbeat and let it go. A scrape outside broke the shape of the moment. The bolt lifted with a scar of iron on iron. An usher's head appeared in the doorway, cap wet, face disciplined. "Your Highnesses," he said. "The packet has been located. The attendants beg you to return to the ballroom for the second set." The decision had been made for them. It always was. Elodie bowed her head to the news as to a law. Adrian stood very still, then lowered his eyes once, as if before a blade. He turned, and she followed, without needing to be asked. The corridor felt colder. Voices in the distance folded over each other and flattened into a hum. A page ran past and stopped himself just in time to find dignity in stillness. The antechamber door closed behind them, with a gratitude the wood did not dare to declare. They re-entered the hall through a side entrance that put them near the musicians. The orchestra had found their pace again, a measured cheerfulness, threaded with tension. The master of ceremonies saw them, and altered his pattern with the practiced grace of a man saving a fragile porcelain. His staff came down in a tap that meant, to those who knew, that a schedule had changed and no one should notice. Eyes flicked and dismissed and returned. The court was a school for pretending. Elodie felt the weight of gaze at her shoulder and let it slide. Adrian's step did not falter. The Grand Chamberlain's hand lifted, and the room arranged itself as if nothing at all had occurred in the galleries, as if no door had been bolted, no packet gone astray. The second set could begin. The Master of Ceremonies glanced at his slate and approached Adrian with a small bow that meant apology without guilt. "Your Highness," he murmured, "the next dance with Madame of rank, as agreed." He gave the name softly, satisfied that Adrian knew it and that everyone else did too. Adrian inclined his head. Refusal would be a decision louder than acceptance. He extended his arm in the direction indicated. Elodie stood aside, with the other women who were neither favored nor altogether passed over, in a line that had its own etiquette. The angle of knees, the direction of eyes, the permission given to lips to alter shape when something worth savoring or scorning took place. Adrian offered his arm to the noblewoman allotted by protocol. She was everything the court had been. Polished, quick at pleasing, careful with malice, the way one is careful with spice. He did not look closely enough to grant or deny her any wound of his making. "Your Highness honors me," she said. "I honor the order," he answered, and let the words serve for all he could not say. He moved into the set with automatic grace. The floor met his heel and released it. The line of gentlemen advanced. The chain of ladies turned. Music stitched figures together and turned them into a whole that looked like enjoyment at a distance and duty close to. He did what he had been trained to do. He made his body invisible, except as a sign. He felt Elodie at the edge of the room as one feels a promise made in the morning pressing on the evening. He did not look at her, and yet he saw. The first figure completed itself. The second asked for an attention he gave it and did not. He was there. He was elsewhere. "Is the air too warm for your Highness?" his partner murmured, a question wrapped in concern and calculation. "It is as it is," he said. "Everything is," she replied, with the glimmer of someone who hoped to be clever with the air. He gave her nothing to hook her cleverness on. He had learned too late that generosity to the wrong hunger cost other people's peace. The set demanded a turn with his partner that placed his palm over her glove for 3 beats. He counted them the way a man counts when waiting for pain. He did not hurry them. He did not prolong them. When the turn released, he felt something like relief and filed the shame of feeling it. On the far side of the room, the Master of Ceremonies conferred with the Grand Chamberlain, both men arranging human furniture with such skill that no one would see the strain. Servants passed with wine no one wanted. A young officer told a story about a horse as if it mattered. An ambassador practiced the art of wearing a face that had no country. Elodie focused on breathing the room into something she could stand within. She had learned to shorten her attention to the length of her own hand, the fold of the glove at the wrist, the seam she had reinforced after it frayed last season, the tiny curl of thread that had lifted when it should have lain flat. She would trim it when she returned to her apartments. The thought of a needle and a quiet chair steadied her more than any voice could. She watched the set, because not watching would read as sulk or rebellion, and she had no appetite for making the work of existing even heavier. Adrian's back remained an argument written in good ink. He danced with the noblewoman as with a mirror. He gave her the portion a prince gives when position requires nothing else. The music shifted into the change that signals approaching completion. Elodie let her breath lengthen. She could endure one more figure, one more bow, one more smile for the woman at her left, whose perfume gave her a headache that would need a quiet room and a wet cloth later. She could endure. A disturbance began at the far end of the floor, not loud. The sound of a man who had forgotten how to modulate because he had been asked to carry a message too heavy for his rank. A senior official of the household, pale, lips tight to hold in anxiety, threaded through the dancers with a paper held like a relic. He had the look of someone who would prefer to vanish but had been made the mouth of a fact. He came straight to the small space near Adrian's turn, bowed too low, almost stumbled, and waited until the figure allowed proximity. Adrian saw him and registered difference in the man's color, the angle of his shoulders. Difference is what he watched for because it was what he had to correct or protect. He stepped out of the figure without breaking it and bent his ear. The murmur was not audible to the room. The paper was. Authorization, the official said in a whisper that held a tremor, by the chief of police, an extract from an intercepted letter. Adrian did not hold out his hand. He nodded once. Continue. The official sought the smallest elevation he could find, a step near the musicians, and found his voice without raising it. By order, he said, and the words were simple, fragile. A matter for the hearing of His Royal Highness. The letter presented refers to the late uncle of Her Royal Highness by name, in connection with a clandestine society inimical to the peace of France. He spoke the name and the relation without adornment. He did not speak them loudly. He did not have to. Sound can cut like a knife when it is honed by the knowledge that people want to hear it. Conversations thinned to thread. The musicians faltered and found their place again out of fear of being seen as agents of silence. Elodie felt the first syllable strike like a cold draft under a door. Names carry more heat than truth. She did not move. She could not have moved without making motion mostly about her. The women to her left and right did the collective kindness of stillness. It was the least they could do, and the most. The official continued, reading only an extract, as if he could lessen the harm by offering less sound. The letter named a circle, a meeting, contributions vague enough to mean what any listener wanted them to mean. It had dates, and dates wear the costume of truth. It had a seal, and wax is a faithless thing when pressed by the wrong hand. Adrian listened without altering the position of his shoulders. Alteration is confession. He could feel his heart, not because it quickened, but because it did not, and that steadiness felt like a betrayal of something tender. He let the official finish a sentence and lifted a palm that meant, enough for now. Who holds the document? He asked, the question level, as if asking who held a chair. The steward, Your Highness, the official said. It passed under the eyes of the minister's aide. I am instructed to present it for inspection. Not here, Adrian said. Of course, the official murmured, already stepping back, grateful to have been given a limit. The room had gone colder by degrees. People sought safety in the geometry of spacing themselves correctly. A woman adjusted a pearl and found her fingers shaking. A man put his hand on the pommel of a sword he was not carrying. Even the musicians held their bows more tightly, as if music could be held down like unruly hair. The master of ceremonies, trained to prevent panic from finding an expression, lifted his staff. The tap he gave the floor was a command only men like him hear as command. Friends, he said, voice even and almost cheerful. We pause a moment. The second set will resume shortly. Refresh yourselves. It was a lie told for mercy. No one moved. Elodie kept her eyes on the floor for the number of heartbeats it takes for humiliation to make a person float above their own body. She did not float. She held. She could feel the shape of her uncle's face as she last saw it, in the square of a kitchen door, red from sun, eyes soft with a laughter that cost him a tooth. He had never kept secrets. He had kept chickens. Memory was a sin here. It gave no defense. A woman 2 seats away whispered, pitched like a prayer. It will be a misunderstanding. Everything is, another replied. Adrien heard the words because silence had become a chamber that echoed small sounds. He did not look toward Elodie. To look would have been to drag her into the center of a spectacle he could not yet control. He felt where she stood the way sailors carry the map of a coast in their bodies after 3 storms. He did not move toward her. He moved toward the official, toward the Grand Chamberlain, toward the place where facts could be forced to show their faces. The Grand Chamberlain met him halfway, chest high with duty, and the knowledge that history behaves badly when watched. Your Highness, he said, a question packed into 3 syllables. We will see the paper, Adrien said. Not here. Immediately, the Chamberlain replied. The master of ceremonies glanced at him, and they exchanged enough information with their eyes to dismantle or save a kingdom for an hour. The staff tapped again. "A recess," the voice announced. "The next figure at our leisure." Elodie stood. Standing was the only thing to do that was not begging or running. Her ladies came without being called because a woman should not be the only woman in a room that had turned like this. They arranged themselves with the care of people making a human wall around a candle. Adrian felt the strand of his partner's presence tug at his sleeve. She had been abandoned mid-set, which was a slight. He had insulted her because he could not avoid insulting his wife. He turned a fraction and gave the noblewoman a bow so precise it would register as apology without confession. She took it as he meant it and stepped back into the anonymity of a secondary rank with the elegance of someone used to losing without admission. The senior official waited on the step with the paper clutched in his two hands, as if the thinner he made himself, the less harm would travel through him. He did not want to be blamed for the news he had carried. He would be blamed anyway by someone who needed blame more than truth. The air smelled of wax and fear, and the sharp tang of orange leaf that had followed them back from the gallery. The musicians let their arms fall and looked at their bows as if they had never seen them before. The floor, polished to a mirror, reflected a room that had not yet decided what it was. Elodie lifted her chin and met no one's eyes, which is how one meets everyone's without tearing. The curl of thread at her glove had shifted further loose, a little white path wandering where no path should be. She imagined pulling it and undoing the entire glove in one long, wasteful line, and the image steadied her because it would be disaster she chose. The official opened his mouth to read again, apologetic and compelled. The room made space for the sound. He felt their hunger and hated it and fed it because he had to. He lifted the paper, found the sentence, and continued in a voice that did not crack only because he held it like a glass full to spilling. "The extract suggests," he said, "a meeting at which funds were pledged in the cause of—" He hesitated. He could not say the word without making it a flag in the room. "Certain ideas against the peace," he finished, and the cowardice of his phrasing did nothing to blunt the blade. Elodie did not blink. To blink is sometimes to concede. Adrian let the words come and settle, and then did not let them sink. He stood taller by the width of a breath. He turned to the court, with the expression that tells men he will suffer them only so long as they deserve it. He drew in air to speak. Every eye in the room fixed on him, waiting to see whether he would defend his wife or let the room devour her. Adrian did not let the silence grow teeth. He drew breath and looked once to the Grand Chamberlain, once to the Master of Ceremonies, and then to the room that had sharpened itself on the name just spoken. "This will be examined," he said, voice even, edged by a patience that did not quite reach warmth. "Not here." It was not the sentence Elodie needed, and he knew it as he spoke it. He felt the room receive his decision with relief, the kind of relief that spares itself at another's expense. The official bowed too deeply and clutched the paper as if a wind would take it. The Grand Chamberlain gestured. The Master of Ceremonies tapped his staff. The figures of the quadrille collapsed without disgrace into a recess. Adrian turned to where Elodie stood and found her already standing. She did not look at him. She arranged her face as one arranges a shelf that must not fall. The two ladies nearest her moved with her as if they had rehearsed this exact posture for this exact hour. He wanted to say a word to her that would throw a rope across the distance he had just described with "not here." Etiquette, which had saved him often enough, forbade it. "Your Highness," the Grand Chamberlain murmured, a question made of 3 syllables and 200 years of habit. "The withdrawing room," Adrian said. He did not offer his arm. He did not give the court another gesture to eat. He moved, and the court made a path, and Elodie passed through it with the bearing of a woman who has learned to carry herself as a wall carries weight. Straight, because collapse would be loud. They entered a smaller chamber paneled in pale wood and ideas of calm. Ministers and senior courtiers arrived in a drift, as if the wind had blown them there, Footmen poured wine that went untouched because to drink would be to admit to having mouths. A clerk brought a ledger. A scribe stood with sand ready to dry the signatures that would be offered like oaths and broken like sticks. Adrian did not sit. The paper was set upon a table with a cloth that had been woven for prettier purposes. He looked at it without touching it. The seal had been broken and laid back down. Wax does not forget. Its surface bore a new gloss that did not belong to an old press. He leaned closer. The impression was imperfect in the corner where the dye had been too hot or the hand uncertain. He did not smile. A smile here would be mistaken for victory. The chief of police's authorization hung off the bottom like a borrowed sword at the belt of a boy. A signature that had weight in a street carried another in a palace. Adrian held the two facts in each hand. Chain of custody, he said. An understeward, sweating with the effort of giving the right answers in the right order, named the hands through which the paper had passed. Twice he hesitated. Once he looked at the minister's aide without looking. The aide kept his face like a wall painted with a door that led nowhere. "Fetch the clerk," Adrian said to a page, and the boy flew. He examined the handwriting. The letters were careful, obedient to models. The slope of the hand spoke of a man taught by a certain master, whose flourishes belonged to a later decade than the date written at the top of the page. Adrian put his finger half an inch above the line and did not touch. The clerk arrived with sleep in his hair and fear in his eyes. He bowed until it became dangerous. "You copied this?" Adrian asked. He could make his voice carry authority without drum or trumpet. It was an old skill. "At the request of the minister's aide, Your Highness," the man answered, looking at the floor the way a man looks at a well when he hopes it holds water. "He said it would preserve the original, which had been poorly kept." "He told you to alter the date?" Adrian said. "No, Your Highness," the clerk stammered. "The date was as in the original. Only the seal." The aide's head turned a fraction. The clerk stopped speaking. Adrian saw the motion and made a note in the quiet place where he kept knives. "Only," he prompted. Only that the seal was no longer clear. The clerk whispered, each word a separate surrender. A fresh impression was taken. I did not hold the die." Adrian's gaze moved to the aide. He did not ask the man to speak. He waited the way one waits for a man to push himself off a wall he is leaning on, knowing he will either stand or fall. The aide lifted his chin by a degree. "The integrity of the crown sometimes requires—" He paused, searched for a better phrase, and found none good enough. "Clarity," he finished. "Clarity," Adrian repeated, as if the word itself were under inspection. He shifted his attention to the Grand Chamberlain. "The registry," he said. "The parish where the uncle died. The notary who recorded it. Send for the records and for any letter kept by the curé concerning that household. And send to the prefecture to alert them to our request." The Grand Chamberlain signaled. Pages left the room like arrows. The scribe wrote names. Sand fell. The smell of ink rose like a small force. Adrian drew himself to full height with no flourish. "While we wait," he said, "there will be no further discussion of this matter in the ballroom. We will receive guests with civility. The musicians may retire." No one contradicted him. The habit of obedience is a comfort when the floor tilts. He felt the nearest advisor shift his weight, as if preparing to argue a softer course. Adrian did not look at him. He looked at Elodie. She sat where her ladies had guided her, a chair that faced the room without offering cover. Her hands lay in her lap, the gloves as white as a thing grown in darkness. She lifted her eyes and met his without accusation. That somehow made the room quieter. He crossed the space between them. A path opened among men who cannot bear witness when two people decide something that will alter how the rest of them live. He stopped at a distance that would not be named scandal and would not be named carelessness. The room listened to air. "If you wish to withdraw," he said. the sentence shaped to be heard by her and understood by all. You may. Her lips parted. She drew breath and changed her mind about the first answer. I will not leave the room that names me, she said. He felt the blood in his hands, a sensation as old as swords. He inclined his head by a measure that belonged to gratitude and could be mistaken for approval. He turned and let the minister see his profile, not his eyes. Proceed, he said. The night thickened. The reception was dismissed by layers. The door to the great hall was held open long enough for a line of foreign envoy wives to pass, then closed long enough to comfort a minister who needed closing to do the job his tongue did not. Footmen walked the corridors with the discretion of men trained to make sound useless. The palace shifted into the machinery that had moved through other crises, each so different a century apart that they had come to look alike. Adrian stood so long that the chair behind him ceased to exist as an option. He did not want the posture of sitting. He wanted the posture of standing against a thing that killed better men than him. He called for the aide again. The man came with the careful smile of a person who knows how to mix truth and poison and hopes the taste is sweet enough to hide the heat. At whose suggestion was this letter brought forward? Adrian said. The chief of police saw fit, the aide began. Names, Adrian said. He did not raise his voice. He lowered mercy. The aide's eyes flicked to the Grand Chamberlain, to the scribe, to the clerk who seemed to have shrunk since he arrived. Your Highness, he said, I advise only the safety of the crown. By harming the wife of the crown prince, Adrian said. The aide did not say yes. He could not say no and keep his place. He said nothing. Adrian let the nothing become a room the aide had to stand in. Then he spoke to the Grand Chamberlain without moving his gaze. The minister's aide is to remain under discreet guard, he said. He is not to depart this corridor. He is to be treated with civility. He is not to be believed. The Grand Chamberlain bowed. Guards appeared without appearing. Adrian dismissed the aide with a slight motion of the head and turned to the official who held the letter. You have done your part, he said. No more. The official's relief was nearly obscene. He bowed with a gratitude that used up all the space around him and left the room itself a little larger. In the corner of the chamber, Elodie's ladies arranged a shawl and a glass of water on a side table with the reverence of women assembling a chapel. Elodie did not take the water. She did not refuse it. She sat with a stillness that made refusal unnecessary. A page returned with a small packet. It smelled of damp and wax, and the breath of running. From the prefecture, he gasped. To announce the messenger is sent to the parish. The curé's house will be visited. Good, Adrian said, and heard how poor a word that was for the use he put it to. He looked at the clock on the mantel and counted the hours that had already confined themselves to this room. He looked at the window and found the night pressing its forehead against the glass. He could not bear to hold speeches in his body that he would not deliver. He crossed to Elodie again and inclined his head toward a smaller door. A word, he said. It was not a command. It was a risk. She stood. Her ladies rose with her and held their place like posts marking a boundary. She passed through the door with Adrian into the little room that had once been a sewing chamber. A banked fire found its courage at their entry. The walls remembered women's talk and needlework, and kept their counsel. I hesitated, he said, before he could find a way to make it prettier. Out there. Yes, she said. I thought I was protecting you by giving the room a process instead of a fight. You gave them room to decide how to think of me. He took the blow and did not move. I will correct it at dawn. You cannot correct what has not yet been acknowledged, she said. Only alter what it becomes. A log shifted in the grate and sent a column of sparks up the throat of the chimney. They watched the light, as if watching it would teach them something about staying. I was brought up to believe that feeling is a nuisance to be cleaned away before work begins, he said. I mistook you for a feeling. A sound left her that was almost the breaking of a laugh, and almost the breaking of a glass. And now? Now I find I cannot begin without you. he said, and hated how simple and expensive the words were. She took them as one takes a coin to pay for bread, not as an ornament, not as a promise. Then begin, she said, with what we can do. He nodded once. Your curé, he said. He may have letters. He keeps everything, she answered. He knows where papers sleep. And neighbors? I will not ask them to speak. They have already given enough. We do not make a village pay for a palace's hunger. He accepted that limit and let it change his plan. The equerry would go to the curé, not to doors that had never learned to open to men in uniform. I admired you tonight, he said, knowing admiration did not heal humiliation. For not leaving the room. I stayed because you did not say my name, she said. Had you said it then, I would have left because there would have been nothing left to hold. He met that truth with his own. I was afraid I would make it worse. You did, she said. Then, after a breath, but not in a way that cannot be mended. He closed his eyes for a moment. He let himself have that. Then he opened them and returned to work. The corridor filled and emptied like a lung. Notes came and went, some with seals still warm, others with the dust of archives on them. Adrian handled each without haste and without the performance of haste. Performance is for rooms he will not be in. The ledger recorded names and pages. The scribe shook sand and cleared his throat when it would help no one. Toward the darkest hour, the clerk was brought again, this time without the aid. He confessed what was already obvious. He had copied. He had been told it was necessary for the safety of the state. He had seen the seal repressed. He had not asked the questions he should have asked, because questions are expensive when a man needs his position more than his pride. Go, Adrian said. Your work here is ended. The man nearly wept with relief. He tried to turn into gratitude. He failed and left gratitude strewn like dropped pins on the floor. The palace had its own weather. Somewhere distant, a door clapped like thunder. In the courtyard, the rain softened and stopped, the drainpipes sighing as if they were allowed to rest as long as the people within were not. Toward dawn, a courier in the livery of the prefecture arrived, wet, breath short, eyes bright with the triumph of a man who has brought a paper faster than a horse should run. He presented stamped confirmations. The parish register bore the entry for the uncle. Name, date, cause of death, listed in the old hand that had outlasted 2 governments. Fever, not a barricade. The notary's record aligned. A letter from the curé arrived with a second courier only minutes later, folded and sealed in a manner that looked like a prayer. It testified to the uncle's service in a royalist levy during the uprisings and to small acts of charity no one keeps track of unless they mean to remember a man kindly. Adrian read each, not once, not twice, but until the shapes of the letters ceased to be art and became texture. He let the truth settle where anger had wanted to live. He looked up and found the Grand Chamberlain watching him with the careful attention of a man restoring a clock. Prepare the throne room, Adrian said. We will receive the court at first bell. The proofs are to be displayed. The aid is to be presented to the prefecture's men with a note to the minister. His service here is finished. The Grand Chamberlain bowed, and the bow was a relief disguised as duty. Orders flew. Rooms woke and blinked. Servants moved in patterns they could trace with their eyes closed and dreamt of sleep on their feet. Adrian turned and found Elodie where she had been, where she had chosen to be, present. The 2 ladies nearest her had fallen into the kind of doze that preserves dignity. They woke at the shift of his step. He stopped before Elodie and did not speak at first. The morning had taken the night's voice and replaced it with something cooler. The truth is in hand, he said. The rest will follow. She regarded him as one regards a river that has finally returned to its bed. The court will not enjoy being corrected. They will enjoy less being led by a liar, he said. I have indulged too many men who preferred a crown weak enough to bend where they pressed. Her shoulders moved, the smallest sign of breath rolling out a long-held ache. You will stand beside me, she said. It was a statement in the shape of a question offered to a man who had once said, "Not here." "Yes," he answered. The word fitted him as if he had been made for it. "At the chapel hour the bells will call them. We will be there already." She gave him the ghost of a nod that meant consent without surrender. He felt more steadied by that than by the stamped papers in his hand. He turned to the household officers who had arrived at the edge of the room, drawn by the gravity of decisions. "Her Royal Highness's apartments," he said. "See that she is prepared for audience. No fuss, no white silk tonight, nothing that reads as apology. The dress she chooses, as she chooses it." A dozen invisible courtesies shifted at once. The orders went, brisk, precise, unadorned. "And yours, Your Highness?" the Grand Chamberlain asked. "My uniform," Adrian said. "Not a court coat. The one I wear when I intend to work." The Grand Chamberlain bowed again, and that small repetition was the palace admitting that the morning would belong to a different script. They left the withdrawing room together, not touching, the air between them altered enough that even the torches took note. In the corridor, the first thin light slid along the floor like a promise testing its edge. The palace smelled of ash and tallow, and the wet iron of spent rain. Somewhere a maid whispered to another in relief that was more prayer than gossip. In her dressing room, Elodie allowed her ladies to move around her like hands around a flame. They did not chatter. They did not offer opinions. One brought water to rinse the night from her face. Another laid out fabrics with the gravity of setting relics upon an altar. Elodie touched each and shook her head until a sober wool lay where silk had been expected. The embroidery at the wrist of her gloves caught the new light and made it seem warmer than it was. "Your Highness," one brave voice asked, "shall we alter the cuff with the loose thread?" "No," she said. "Let it remain. It tells the truth." Across the palace, Adrian stood before a mirror that refused to lie to him and arranged his uniform with the practice of a man who understands that cloth is a language. He pinned nothing unnecessary to his chest. He left the medal that had meant little to him on the table. He tightened a strap and felt the old steadiness of leather and habit. A valet ghosted in and out with the quiet doom of men whose masters are about to decide something that will make other men angry. The bells began to speak, deep and unhurried, rolling into the spaces between rooms and collecting footsteps like water collects leaves. The throne room opened its bright face. Guards took their stations without clatter. Ambassadors arrived with faces pressed clean of opinion. Peers of the realm stacked themselves in ranks that looked like agreement and were not. Adrien offered his arm to Elodie at the threshold where private ended and public began. He did not look to see who watched. He felt the steadiness in his body, a steadiness that would not serve if it did not include her. She placed her gloved hand lightly where the cloth of his sleeve met bone. The gesture did not ask, it accepted. They stepped into the room, arranged for their undoing, and made it an instrument instead. The Grand Chamberlain pronounced the order of business. The proofs were set upon a side table under a light that offered no shadows for cowardice. The aide was nowhere to be seen. He had been escorted along a corridor he had once owned and now could not find his way back to. The Master of Ceremonies took his place with a staff that would make only the sounds this hour required. Adrien let his gaze pass over the court and then settle on the only face that mattered. The air between them held what it had held in the antechamber, in the withdrawing room, in the small sewing chamber where Sparks had shown them what light can do if given air. "Shall we?" he said. Not for the room, not for history, but for the woman who had asked him to stand. "We shall," she answered, and they faced the morning together as the first clear beam of sun found the chandeliers and made each crystal ring like a soft, bright bell. The light struck crystal and scattered over faces like a benediction that had earned the right to be given. Adrien felt the weight of the room gather at his spine and did not bend. He stood with Elodie beside him and let the court discover what it meant to see them in the same piece of air. The Grand Chamberlain stepped forward as agreed, and began to speak in the careful cadence that keeps a room from breaking. He announced the purpose of the gathering. He announced the proofs. A footman brought the documents to a side table set under clear light, and a clerk stood ready to read. Adrian did not let the clerk begin. He moved to the table himself and placed his palm on the first page without touching it. "You will look," he said to the court. "Then you will listen." He gave the nod. The clerk read what mattered: parish entries, the old hand in the book, the notary's record, the cure's testimony folded like a prayer made legible. Fever, service in a royalist levy, alms given. The words were simple. They did not beg. They stood. Murmurs rose, then checked themselves when Adrian turned, the habit of trembling before a greater force older than any one of the men present. He waited until silence was not merely absence of sound, but the presence of attention. "Last night," he said, voice even, "this court was asked to judge a woman on the basis of a forged clarity." He let the phrase hold. Eyes moved without moving. Breath paused. The seal was repressed, the date dressed in a hand that does not belong to the time it pretends to wear. A chain of custody made of air where iron should be. He did not look at the minister's aide. He did not have to. Guards at the door stood with a new kind of stillness that announced a man had already been invited to wait in a room that was not a room. "And because of that," he continued, "you were invited to measure my wife as if she were a risk rather than a person." The word wife entered the space and rearranged it. Men who had never used it for her felt their throats constrict around syllables they had not yet made. Adrian took one step toward Elodie. He did not make a show of it. He made a decision. He pivoted so that the court could see his profile and her face at once. He lifted his right hand and removed his glove, a small, everyday act that could carry a country in it. He held her gaze for the briefest moment, an asking without words, an answer without sound, and took her right hand, still in the embroidered linen she had refused to change. The fabric caught on the callus at the base of his fingers. He did not let go. He raised their joined hands to his chest and pressed the back of her glove against the beat everyone could see and no one could feel. He laid his bare palm over it, the shield and the admission at once. "You will not speak of her as if she were a question," he said. "She is the answer to the only question that matters to me. And to the crown, she is what her title declares. Not shadow, not if, not apology, Her Royal Highness, my wife." The words were not loud. They carried because he let them be true. Elodie stood, still, the glove warm where his hand covered it, her breath catching once and then finding a new pace. She did not look at the floor. She looked at him, and then at the people who had taught her to look at no one. A line that had held for 3 years gave way inside her without collapse. The master of ceremonies, quick to understand what sound must come next, brought his staff down with a single measured tap. The court bowed like a field in wind. Some did it because duty had reminded them of itself. Some because relief had. A few because the sight had done what arguments cannot. Adrian kept their hands together through the bow. He did not release her to accept any man's genuflection. When the room lifted, he looked to the Grand Chamberlain. "Make it known," he said. "The document is false. The man who pressed the false seal is in custody. The household will not entertain further slander under my roof." The Grand Chamberlain's bow contained his agreement and his gratitude. He gestured. The aide was led quietly from the doorway by officers who knew the difference between spectacle and justice. Adrian turned back to Elodie. He did not hide. "The apartments of the Crown Prince are henceforth shared," he said, "for the room, but also for her. Beginning tonight. The privileges that have belonged to her in letter will belong to her in fact. If you doubt me, do not come to dinner." There were a few smiles that were not unkind. The court is taught to enjoy a sentence that nails down more than it appears to. Elodie felt the flicker of laughter under her sternum and refused it only because laughing here would be to accept too many apologies at once. She inclined her head the smallest degree, a gesture that made the promise inside his words a pact. The Grand Chamberlain raised his staff. "Shall we proceed to the chapel?" he asked, and it was not a question. The procession formed with the soft speed of habit. Guards lifted halberds. Ambassadors settled their mouths into the shape that reads as neutrality from any angle. Peers aligned themselves. Adrian offered his arm and did not receive permission in it. He received assent. They moved under the great doors and into the cool that a chapel keeps for itself even in bright weather. Stone held the morning. Voices fell as if they wanted to be kept. The chapel's light was bright without glittering, settling on faces and wood and the edges of kneelers like a hand knowing where to press. They took their places side by side at the front, knees bent, hands folded. Silence rose up clean. A chaplain began the brief service appointed for Thanksgiving. He did not lengthen it. He did not take it for himself. He read the psalm that speaks of steadfastness, and the other that speaks of mercy, binding truth. Adrian let the words roll over the parts of him that needed to be washed without asking for explanation. He had never been a man of long prayers. He had been a man of orders. He found, not for the first time today, that he wanted to be a man of vows. He lowered his head. He did not close his eyes all the way. He saw Elodie's gloved hands beside him resting flat, the embroidery catching a small tremble of light. Without thought, without strategy, he turned his hand and found the back of hers with his knuckles. Not a grasp, not a claim. A contact like the first two notes of a melody that had waited at the edge of being written. She did not pull away. She did not look down. She let the touch exist as the fact it was. They stood when the service called them to stand. The chaplain intoned the final words, and the wish for peace did not sound like a formality. As they stepped into the side aisle to leave by the nearer door, Adrian leaned closer without breaking the careful space. "When we go out there," he said, almost without moving his lips, "whatever they see, let us see each other." "I already do," she replied, voice a breath that felt like heat in a cool room. The inner gates opened. The outer courtyard unfolded like a held breath at last exhaled. Pensioners and townspeople had gathered since dawn, a press of bodies kept at a respectful breadth by a line of guards who let hope come as far as was safe. The murmur that rose at the first sight of them was not the polished sound of a salon. It was the sound of cobblestones and hands that work, and eyes that believe what they can see. Adrian felt the hum move through him and carry away nothing he could not afford. He stepped with Elodie into the light that had been waiting for them, and did not lift his hand to shelter his eyes. He wanted to feel burned if burned was what truth would do. "Show them," he said under his breath, a request he had not rehearsed. She looked at him as if he had finally asked the right question. Then she turned not to the crowd, but toward him. He raised their hands again, not with the drama of a man who loves drama, but with the precision of a man who knows when to let the earth tilt. He pressed his lips once to the linen at her knuckles. The texture of the embroidered thread met his mouth. It tasted like work, and a quiet he had not deserved and needed. There was a sound from the courtyard that lives in none of the manuals. It was not a cheer. It was not a prayer. It was a human sound that happens when a crowd feels that something difficult has chosen a simpler path. They did not linger. They let the moment belong to others, because they had claimed enough inside. The guards parted to allow a small passage along the edge. The sun had strengthened without becoming cruel. They made their way toward the gallery, toward the orangery and the garden, because walking after ceremony is how one learns to breathe again. In the shade of the citrus leaves, warmth gathered without weight. Drops from last night's rain still held in the cups where leaf met stem. A gardener worked with his head lowered and found a reason not to be exactly where he was. The orangery glass threw back a softened version of the day. Adrian slowed. The silence between his ribs was new. He did not fear it. He turned to her. The cloak she had worn last night had been set aside in favor of the sober wool she had chosen for mourning. The glove with the loosened thread remained her choice. He did not touch it yet. "May I?" he said, and reached into the space between them as if reaching into a river, whose current he accepted rather than fought. "You may," she said, and offered the smallest movement of her wrist. It was enough. He held her right hand again and felt the warmth of it through linen. He lifted it to eye level so that he could see the embroidery close, the pattern she had made without asking permission. The tiny loop of errant thread curled like a new thought. "You will not mind," he said, "if I am careful where I should have been bold, and bold where I should have been careful." She breathed once and let the breath change the shape of her mouth. "Not if you tell me which is which. I will spend the rest of my life learning," he said. The sentence came out unadorned. It did not wobble. She looked down at their joined hands. The cuff had a bit of damp from the earlier morning, a faint, darker white at the seam. "Take it," she said, not quite a command, not quite a surrender. He understood at once. He slid his fingers to the glove's hem and paused. "Here," he said, and his tone asked more than the word did. She tipped her chin. "Here." He peeled the glove back slowly, turning it inside out over knuckles that trembled because the air was cool and because the air was air. Her skin, when it met light, did not startle the day. It confirmed it. He did not look around. He did not perform this for anyone's eye. He folded the glove the way one folds a letter written and read many times, every crease remembered by the paper. He smoothed it with his thumb only once. Then he slipped it into the breast pocket of his uniform, the pocket set near where men tuck things they cannot fight without. "It stays," he said. "Here." Her hand, bare now, hovered in the air between them, as if unsure of its rights. He took it, palm to palm, flesh to flesh, the oldest treaty. He did not close too tightly. He did not hold loosely enough to abandon. He let their hands learn each other with the patience he had not offered his own heart. She felt the beat she had felt through linen, and now without. It did not frighten her. It anchored her. She raised her eyes to his, and found no one else there. "You have given me back my name," she said. "I will give you back your sleep. And if I cannot sleep—" He meant it, but his mouth softened around the words. "Then we will walk the galleries until you can," she said. "And when the court whispers, we will let it be wind." He inclined his head like a man receiving good counsel. "I am sorry," he said. And the words did not seek to cancel. They sought to join. "I am not a ledger," she replied, gentle. "There is no sum that balances. There is only the day ahead." He smiled then, a small, startled thing, as if he had been forgiven by a weather he had thought would always break on him. "And the night," he said. She did not flinch. "And the night," she answered. And the mention did not scorch. It warmed. They began to walk between the tubs of trees, as if discovering a house they had lived in separately. The gardeners pretended to see a pest on a leaf. A footman turned away and studied a hinge with a devotion that would have impressed an engineer. Even the sparrows decided not to interfere. Adrian did not speak for a few steps. Then he did. "When I stood in that room and said, 'Not here,' I believed I was sparing you the heat of a fight. You spared the fight and lit the slow burn instead," she said. "No bitterness, knowledge." "I meant to be a shield," he said. "You were a wall," she corrected. "But walls can be leaned against if they do not push back." "I will be a door," he said, half ashamed of the clumsiness and fully committed to the work. "You will be a man," she said, and the word had never sounded so exact. "And I will be a woman. And we will be what the crown can be when it remembers it is worn by people." They reached the last of the orange trees, the one nearest the corner where the glass trapped the sun just enough to warm a stone bench. The bench wore a line of moisture like a veil. He swept it away with his sleeve without ceremony and without asking her to sit. He sat first. It was a small rebellion against the habits that had starved him. She joined him. The closeness made speech unnecessary. The smell of citrus held them in a room no one else could see. After a while, minutes filled with light rather than silence, he turned his face slightly toward hers. "I will make apologies to those who must hear them," he said. "Not because they deserve it, because truth does." "Begin with yourself," she suggested, eyes soft on the orange leaf that trembled without moving. "Then the rest will not turn to performance." He nodded. "I have not touched you," he said, the sentence made of years. "You are touching me now," she replied, looking down at their joined hands. He looked too, perhaps to confirm that it was not borrowed from someone else's life. He raised her hand, slow, asked the question with his eyes, and when she did not shake her head, brought her knuckles to his mouth once more. This time, fabric did not soften the contact. He did not linger. He honored. Her breath deepened. "We are being watched," she said, because truth had become a language that carried comfort, not fear. "By citrus trees and a man who has decided a hinge matters more," he said. "Let them." She turned her head toward him, distance closed by degrees so small the world could not measure them. He did not think of what the court would say tonight, tomorrow, in 10 years. He thought of the needle she would take up later to secure the loop of thread he had pocketed, the patience required, the steadiness, the light. He thought of the way she had taken his apology and sorted it into work and gratitude. "I will fail again," he said, "because honesty given in sunlight is not a gift one retracts in shade." "I will remind you," she said, "and you will remind me that I chose this. Not everything, but this." He exhaled, and the breath felt like the first after illness. He reached up with his free hand and, not touching her face, let his palm hover near, a warmth offered and not imposed. She leaned into it by a degree. Contact was made. It did not have to be marked by anyone but them. Across the quadrangle, bells began the half-hour. The sound threaded the air with a promise they had given themselves. Adrian rose, still holding her hand, because standing had become their sentence and their freedom. "Will you walk with me through the rooms that have not yet learned our names?" he asked. "We will teach them," she said, gently. They stepped back into the corridor, where the palace had resumed its ordinary breath, altered entirely. Servants who had known how to serve without seeing learned the new posture of service, acknowledgement. Ministers who had calculated her absence found they had miscounted. The Grand Chamberlain, who had shepherded more princes than most men would meet, watched them pass with a face that said the weight he had carried had become light for one morning. At the door of the throne room, empty now but for its echo, Adrian stopped. He took the glove from his pocket and held it between them. The embroidery shone like a line drawn over a map to mark the road one chooses, not the one is told to take. "Keep it," she said, closing his fingers around it with hers. "It remembers what we forget." "It will live here," he said, tapping his chest above the pocket, "where the crown should sit before it is raised." She smiled. Not the ghost of one, not the careful one, but the one no room could demand and no book could teach. It changed her face in a way that made him want to change every room she would ever be asked to stand in. They began to walk again, the sound of their steps a quiet answer to the questions that had kept them apart. The garden's scent followed them into stone and wood. The light moved with them. The court adjusted itself as courts do when they decide to survive. The city outside took the news in like weather changing for the better. He did not let go of her hand. She did not ask him to. The glove in his pocket warmed with his body and with the life he had finally chosen to feel. They moved forward together, not as spectacle, not as performance, but as two people whose names had returned to them, carrying a crown that weighed less because it was held by 4 hands. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.